Hey, I'm 8. Galaxy and Fire is a mobile video game series following Keith T. Maxwell, a legendary fighter pilot, continually tasked with saving the galaxy. Fans of the series know it began as a mobile Java game developed by Fish Labs back in 2005, which grew to iOS, macOS, Steam, and even a Nintendo Switch release. But that release was after the team behind the original games left Fish Labs and formed Rockfish Games, and ultimately Everspace and its sequel, Everspace 2. However, the franchise was left in the hands of people who, in terms of writing and direction, didn't really know what to do with the franchise. And unfortunately, the original vision for the world building of the franchise had left too, aside from a few key people, one of them being Marc Nagel, the art director for basically all of Fish Labs' titles prior to 2015. For fans of the game out there, let me break it down. Marc is the guy who designed many of the original ships, UI assets, and characters within the games. So, Keith T. Maxwell's beautiful, rugged face is his creation. For context, I was at the launch party for Everspace 2 back in August 2023 in Hamburg, Germany, and had the absolute pleasure of meeting some of the devs behind Galaxy and Fire, and notably Marc himself. After asking him, and other devs, many questions about the development behind the game, I had a lot of new insights I knew the community back at Discord and other various places would love to hear. So after meeting them, I frantically made as many notes of conversations as I could, but just regurgitating the info I'd been given wouldn't do it justice. I took a chance and later reached out to Marc to ask if he was up for an interview, which he was happy to give, and as a longtime Galaxy and Fire fan, this was pretty exciting. Marc was up for the interview, but only in text form over email. So what I did was collected the notes I made at the party, turned them into interview-style questions, and sent them to Marc all at once. He replied a few days later with his answers to each of my questions, which I'm going to read to you now. And there's a few questions that I didn't ask him beforehand, so you'll get to find out what they are soon. With some fun visuals, of course. Enjoy. I'll begin with a disclaimer Marc put at the top of his email. Since it's almost a decade ago since I last worked on the GoF universe, some of the information and memories may have been jumbled in the meantime. Other members of the team might have a different version of the development, as everyone experiences things differently. I try to credit other team members where possible. Sometimes I forget who did what exactly, since the GoF games and its sequels and spin-offs were large collaborative efforts with quickly shifting responsibilities. Can you start by introducing yourself a bit, and let us know what your role was in the Galaxy and Fire universe's development? Hi, my name is Marc Nagel. I started out as a graphic artist in 2005 at Fish Labs, becoming an art director later, and stayed at the company until 2015, roughly 10 years. I was responsible for a lot of the conceptual designs for the GoF ships, and also the character portraits used in-game. The design of the faction emblems also fell into my department. The original UI done for the Java/J2ME version of GoF1 was very minimal. For the iPhone port, a complete overhaul of the UI was done, improving the look and feel, making it look more appealing, and using the then new touchscreen controls of the iPhone. I remember coming up with some of the alien species' names, while others were results of collaborative short brainstorming sessions with the team, which were very amusing. I also created the launch screen and marketing materials for GoF1 at the time. For GoF2, I mainly did character portraits, and tons of ship designs for the different factions. The updated Vosk ships were very fun to do, as they started to look like green crustaceans and trilobites, adding to the alien look. The late edition, the Void, were also very fun, as they looked very different from the other established species. Lots of neon colours and bizarre shapes. For GoF Alliances, I worked on a lot of different ship designs, characters, and planetary structures, in conjunction with our 3D artists, and made the first version of the general UI design. Logo designs were also part of my responsibilities in this project. I remember there were a ton of iterations before we decided on the final version. I created rough storyboards and provided art direction and assets for the GoF Alliance's marketing trailers, edited by Gero Gerlich, our sound engineer, who also had some experience in video editing. External artists were also involved, and their works were used extensively in the footage with some in-house alterations at the end. Later designs for the sequels were done by Frederick Huberly, GoF2. Side note from 8, I'm very sorry if I mispronounce any of these names. And Tim Rouge, GoF3. while I transitioned into the art director role, working on other Fish Labs projects for Volkswagen and Barclaycard at the same time. Still doing UI, concept art, and creating marketing material, screenshots, and app icons. Fish Labs was still a small company, so I had to continue helping out in those areas, sometimes for a long time. So obviously things changed when Deep Silver's GoF3 came about. Can you tell us a bit more about the Inouac Ships? They never made it to the final cut of the game, but a lot of people think they had the potential to be one of the more interesting aspects. The Inouac ships and stations were vaguely inspired by Art Nouveau designs of the 1920s. They were supposed to be mostly organic and were grown instead of traditional shipbuilding processes. The texture was supposed to look superficially like Bakelite, an early predecessor of plastic, having very interesting brownish marbling. On top of the texture, some interesting tribal designs were to be applied, adding to the alien look and feel. The prominent blue energy sails seen in the concepts were for propulsion, weapons, and deflector shields. They can also be found on the Inouac asteroid stations. An idea was to use these sails for solar energy collection and so on, but this was just loose brainstorming. I remember that Frederick, 3D and UI design of GoF2, made a test model of one of my designs for the Inouac ship and tested it in-game, adding some effects and trails to the ship. It looked promising, but ultimately it was cut. I guess they didn't fit the change game design after my departure. Did you work on the original Fish Labs version of GoF3? And is there anything more that you can share with us? One development screenshot of a planet exists, but nothing more. Yeah, I worked a while on the project. I designed a couple of ships such as the big Manticore carrier ship, which was based on a design done for the GoF2 Supernova DLC. I also designed the Nivelian battleship, Garuda, which was almost too large when we tried to use realistic sizes. We had to do a lot of back and forth in this one, until we had a manageable size, which didn't look too gargantuan. It was comical when 3/4 of your screen is a Nivelian battleship, so we had to downsize it. Later designs for GoF3 were created mostly by Tobias Frank and Adrian Lucian, two very talented concept artists who took over the workload. Speaking of cut content, the Old Ones from Alliances. Can you tell us a bit more about them? The Old Ones were an idea for GoF Alliances. They were supposed to be an ancient, almost immortal race lurking in the background. As the name suggests, this was inspired by H.P. Lovecraft and its pantheon of alien gods. I made a couple of quick concepts of what they could look like. Some more typical sci-fi, others had a closer look to the Lovecraftian lore I was inspired by. There was no real place for them at the end, but I would have liked them to be part of the events and maybe daily quests, etc. Going way back now, you worked on Deep, a submarine odyssey as well, didn't you? Was there anything interesting you can share about that? I designed a couple of submarines for the game, but since Deep was developed for Java mobile phones like the Sony Ericsson K700, they could not be done, considering the extreme technical limitations of the devices. As a result, the ships and stations looked more like they would belong in space in a sci-fi environment. Personally, I would have liked them to look more like they could withstand the extreme deep-sea pressure. I also did the Deep logo and some marketing material like the launch screen for the game. I also remember that the reason for the planet being a gigantic blob of water without a core or submerged landmass was also purely technical. Since the game was based on the GoF framework, space was switched out with water, color gradient in the background plus bubbles, to create that deep sea feeling. Back to classic GoF now. Is there anything interesting you can tell us about designing Keith and the rest of the gang? The character portraits were indeed very exaggerated looking, since they were originally developed for UI assets done on the old Java phones. This style was also kept for the iPhone versions, as they were more easily identifiable. Their whimsical nature also made them a fan favourite for some reason. My plan was to replace them all eventually with more polished high-res versions, but there was sadly no time for it. I did one test for Keith once, overpainting a rough 3D sculpt done as Sculptress. Okay, hi, this is 8 here again. I want to give context for this next question. I've done a lot of texture modding, and I have a secret project that I've talked about and never shown any footage of. So I know a lot about the texture organization for the game, and it's messy. When I was at the launch party for Everspace, I brought this up with Marc just in conversation, and he just remembered, back in the day how they handled things. So I wanted to rephrase it for the interview. So this isn't me being rude, this is me just following on from a conversation that we had. Can you tell me why GoF2's texture organization is so messy? There are a lot of sprite sheets that seem redundant or have duplicate textures in them. Did you have to cheat with Abyss Engine's limitations? This is more of a question for the technical and 3D artists, but I'll try and answer it from my perspective. Sometimes there were a lot of changes and additions to the projects, and this definitely contributes to a certain amount of mess. As far as the UI textures are concerned, I think there was an issue with rotation of UI assets. For example, sometimes we had to do 2 versions of the same asset. Later, these rotations were done via code, but this was also not very elegant, thus creating more work for the programmers. We often reused assets instead of creating new ones for different, sometimes exotic, resolutions and platforms. This was mostly a time-saving thing, since we had so much to do on other important projects. Sometimes the results were not overly pleasing, but it did the job. It was admittedly a bit chaotic at times. What's the GoF2 App Icon meant to resemble the Roman numeral 2? Good question. The silhouette of the Nivelian fighter lent itself perfectly for the app icon. It looked very minimalistic while still transporting the sci-fi theme very well with the planet in the background. I think one of the 3D artists, Marco Unger, came up with that. He had some very cool ideas and he iterated a couple of versions. Long story short, yes, it is the Roman numeral 2. Kind of a mix between a happy accident because the ship just happened to look like this and intentional design. Who came up with the troll face Easter egg? Not sure, but I suspect one of the 3D team. They were heavily involved with memes and internet culture and so on. I think they hid a poster in one of the freighters. There was a lot of that. Another side note from 8. This question has been something on my mind for so long. And it was quite an experience to ask the developers themselves in person what this meant. So, here we go. Speaking of Easter eggs, the community has been dying to know the story behind KNOS, or KNOS, which has made its way from very early Fish Labs games right up to Everspace 2. What does it mean? KNOS was one of these inside jokes that were everywhere in our games. I remember adding it to a Rally Master Pro texture, as I wanted more of these typical rally-related stickers of sponsors on the cars. KNOS did not really have a meaning. It just sounds funny. I once jokingly asked the guys the same question and they just said, well, it's KNOS. Just KNOS. Of course it didn't clear anything up, but we stuck to it as an absurd little thing in our games. At least that's my take on the legend. 8 again here. I do remember being at the party and I brought it up with Mark and there was a couple of other developers present. If I recall correctly, it was Matthias Kummer we were talking with, and he remarked that it was simply a reference to NOS, like Nitro. So that clears it up. It's as simple as that, just a funny little Easter egg that they came up with for no special reason. It just sounded funny. Regards, Marc Nagel, 11/2/2023. And it's 8 again. There we go. A handful of questions graciously answered by one of the very original developers of the franchise we know and love. If you want to support Mark, go check out his ArtStation profile linked in the description. He has posted a lot of GoF concept art there, as well as lots more from his other projects. Mark, to you and the rest of the team from the OG Fish Labs, thank you for helping make Galaxy on Fire, Deep, and your other titles such a wonderful series of games. You guys have built core memories for myself and many other fans, so yeah, thank you. From the looks of things, right now Galaxy on Fire is a dormant franchise, sadly buried under about 5 layers of corporations and bureaucracy. So it's quite special that we're able to get insight from folks like you. And Mark, to you in particular, thank you for agreeing to this interview. This is really fantastic, and I'm very happy that I'm not just left regurgitating information, but we're actually hearing it from you yourself, so thank you. And to everyone else still watching, thanks for doing so. Now, go take a look at another video I made right here.